This week's video is all about creating a miniature version of a teapot I made recently, which I really liked. At this scale, teapots almost feel like a novelty, and despite me making them very rarely, I love the process of trimming and assembling these tiny vessels. Despite them being quite finicky and complex, it's a challenge I always look forward to. This was the last small teapot I made, in a batch of about 20 or so, and I've hung on to this one as part of my archive, and it's very useful for taking photographs of, too. But my level of skill has improved a lot since making this, so I want to have another crack at making some small teapots, and to hopefully improve on this. The body and the lid of the teapot will be thrown on one of these MDF bats, which are set in place attached to a leather hard bat of clay underneath them, which I'm just going to trim back so that I can more easily pry the bats off later on. Throwing the components on these means that once they're made, instead of lifting the pot off with my hands alone, which could potentially distort such a delicate vessel, I'll instead just lift the MDF away with the pot on top of it. I begin by weighing out 2 lumps of clay, 450 grams for the body and approximately 150 for the lid. The lid itself will be thrown larger than needed, and then once leather hard, I'll turn it back to the exact shape I want, so that it matches the teapot's body proportionally. I'd rather just have more material to work with, just in case I happen to make a mistake, as compared to too little, as if in that instance a mistake is made, there's very little you can do to salvage it. I spread some slip onto the back of the bat, tap center it, and then firmly shake it in place back and forth a few times to really make sure it's stuck down firmly. Here's the larger version of the teapot I want to make. It has a stepped lid and an angular shoulder, and even though the one I'm going to be making won't look like it's that much smaller, you'll have to bear in mind that this one has already shrunk 12% from its original throne size. I dampen a patch on the bat just a touch. It's not slick with water, as if it is too wet and you try and slam the lump of clay down, it'll never stick, and most likely, as soon as you begin centering, the piece of clay will just slide off to one side. And before any of the real shaping can happen, this lump of clay, which will be the teapot's body, needs to be centered. When the lump of clay is spinning without any undulations or movement in it, I create a hollow in the center with my finger and thumb, pushing them down and outward to form the internal base of the pot. This pot will have quite a wide base, so it's really spread out, and all that thickness left in the walls that surround it is the material that's going to be pulled up to form the actual body of the teapot. It's squeezed between 2 wetted fingers, a knuckle on the outside and my fingertips on the inside, and it's slowly and gradually drawn up. This isn't a process you want to rush. Instead, my movements are very defined, controlled, and once I initiate a lift, I keep my fingers moving up at an even rate, extruding the clay, essentially, through a gap between my fingers that gets smaller and smaller with each subsequent pull. With that being said, as this shape is going to overhang quite a bit, and a gallery will be formed into which the lid will slot, I do purposefully leave the upper wall slightly thick so that there's plenty of material to work with as I collar the neck in and set the opening. With my fingertip, I then push some clay in, designating the area that'll be the gallery. And yes, you can see that it's undulating and wobbling a tiny bit, but at this point, it doesn't really matter if it's there or not, as everything beneath that point is perfectly centered. I'll simply deal with that undulation later. With the rough shape of the pot there, I can begin to go through the finishing procedures for this pot. This begins by removing a skirt of clay from around the base and then scraping away much of the slip from the body, refining the form of the pot, straightening the walls, and getting rid of all that excess slip that, if left on the surface of the pot, will just cause it to dry out slower. I'm not so much pushing the metal in when I do this. Instead, I hover the tool next to where I want the profile of the pot to be, and then I push from the inside out against this metal edge. This is less stressful for the walls of the pot, which means it's less likely to buckle, distort, or collapse inwards. And now the pot is practically finished. I use a sharp turning tool just to remove the worst of the undulation. I prefer doing this on a piece that's as delicate as this as compared to using a wire or a needle to slice away the wavering excess, as I feel like there's less that can go wrong. I can't accidentally slice away too much, nor might the removed clay fall back on top of the vessel or inside it, although it does help to have steady hands, which I don't necessarily have all the time, actually, hence why I was bracing the blade with a finger to support it. Lastly, the rim gets smoothed with the chamois leather, and then I use a pair of callipers to measure the internal opening. Finally, a twisted metal wire is drawn underneath the pot with 2 fingers pressing down on the length. to keep it taut. And here it is compared to the larger version, and whilst they don't look too different at the moment, the difference will be far greater once this piece has been finally fired. As this is a one-off piece I'm making, to get the measurement I need to throw the lid, I simply press my calipers into the clay, invert the calipers, and then I measure these indentations from the outside, giving myself an extra millimetre or so, just to ensure that I have a bit of extra material to work with so that I can trim the lid to fit perfectly, rather than running the risk of the lid potentially being slightly too small, as this is by far the worst of the two evils. A new bat's attached for the lid. It's slipped, tap-centred, and then I rock it back and forth to make sure it's fused firmly in place. I dampen a patch, and ideally I'd be using softer clay for these lids, as there's no height to them, and ultimately, as these are going to be trimmed so much, I can simply throw a very rough form very quickly, with my only real concern being that the clay is in the right places. I don't mind if it's crudely thrown, as long as I can make the damn things quickly. Lids aren't always the most inspiring objects to make. I like turning them, but not throwing them, so if I can make this part of the process painless and easy, you best believe I will. The part I have to be most accurate about though is this corner in between the vertical locating flange, which will be the part that slots inside the teapot, and the horizontal section, which is the part that will keep the lid held aloft. And once this measurement has been set, I scrape away all the slip just so it dries out more quickly overnight. And then a wire is dragged underneath the lid to separate it from the bat. And in hindsight, I should have done this with a thinner wire, as you must have seen just how much that lid moved as the metal was drawn beneath it. And finally, there's the spouts, which I'll throw off the hump, and I usually make multiples of these, just so I can pick and choose the best to work with. The piece of clay is then thoroughly centred, and for this process, instead of working with the entire lump of clay, I'll only be throwing with a small portion towards the top. It's opened up just like normal, and then it's collared in and the walls are thrown into a tapering spout shape. I use a dowel for much of this process, as there's no way I can fit a finger inside to throw these tiny spouts. Then, once the opening is the right size and it's tall enough, I use a curved kidney to shape the outside, running it carefully from top to bottom, and I actually remove quite a lot of material as I do this, thinning the walls out, but I don't mind if my spouts are on the chunky side at this point, as all I do once the spout has turned at the hard is cut away the excess from the inside with a knife, and then I smooth the interior shape with the tapering sponge on a stick. Again, I suppose like lids, I prefer to throw these quickly and roughly, and then do much of the work at the leather hard stage when it comes to actually attaching this to the teapot. I could sit and throw very thin spouts, very slowly, but anyone who's done that will know how much of a pain it is. They buckle, the shape changes, they twist, so I throw them slightly on the thick side and then do all the real, refining work later on. They're placed on a bat, and unlike the other two components, I'll dry these out very differently, as I want them to be relatively soft when it comes time to attach them to the teapot's body, as there's so much material to blend flush together. If the clay is too hard, you can have a really troublesome time trying to blend them together properly. But when the clay is soft, it's so easy. You just have to be a bit more careful, as if you press on the spout too much as you're attaching it, you can deform it. But more on this later. I tend to throw whatever clay is left into a bowl or a vase, anything really. The clay's been centred, so I may as well make something from it. So, I want these parts to dry out at different rates overnight. I want the spouts to be soft, so I'll cover them with a jug, like so. Like this, they really shouldn't dry whatsoever. As for the other pieces, I'll simply sling some loose plastic over them with a piece of wood on the jug like so, just so the plastic sheeting doesn't drape down and stick itself to the still quite soft pots. It's the following morning, and the two parts are now perfectly leather hard after drying out under loose plastic overnight. At this point the pieces can be picked up and held without me having to worry about deforming them, and as you can see the lid is just a bit too tight for the body. But I did this intentionally, so that I can trim it to fit the body of the teapot really snugly. In a way, if it's too tight for this turning process, that's a good thing, as it means I can use each component like a chuck for the other, and then right at the very end I can just scrape a tiny portion off the lid so that it fits perfectly. I trim a bit of clay away from the flange, and then I slot the body of the teapot over it to check that it fits. and once it does slot over nicely, I'll spend some time tidying up the rest of the underside of the lid, smoothing the horizontal plane, and then I remove as much excess clay as I can from inside this well in the centre of the lid. With the piece roughly trimmed, it's taken off, but there is still more to do on it later. And so, to trim the body of the teapot, I brush a band of slip against the metal, position the teapot body over it, and then I tap centre it firmly, the slip quickly drying and fusing the pot in place. But for some additional support, I also use a plastic kidney to seal the bottom, like so. By attaching the pot to the wheel like this, I can trim the entirety of the walls and the top without any lugs of clay getting in the way, or mechanical arms like you might find on a Giffen grip, hindering the areas I can turn. I use sharp tungsten carbide tools to remove material, and then when I feel like the wall is thin enough, I switch to these steel trimmers, as they leave a smoother, more burnished surface, which makes them great for finishing. Now, before I trim the gallery of the teapot, I first trim the lid. As it fits so snugly, I can simply slot it in, the opening of the teapot holding it in place, but I also place a spinner on top to push down through, as sometimes when you apply pressure from the side, like so, it can cause the lid to suddenly jerk upwards, so with the spinner there it just prevents that from happening. I trim away much of the excess, making the lid smaller, and it's at this point that I turn the step on the outside and turn the lid so it's flat. As you can see, there's a strange undulation on the top of the lid, but it shouldn't be too tricky to remove, as I trim in such a way that I only remove material from the highest point that's spinning around, meaning that it should eventually level off. Next, I pierce a hole in the very centre of the lid, which, as it fits so tightly, is crucial. This hole allows air to pass through the vessel as you pour it, and without one the tea would cascade out, glugging and sputtering, but with a hole pierced like so, the liquid will pour out in a much more even stream, provided you've done a number of other things right, too. I quickly flip the lid over to trim the underside of the exit wound, as otherwise there'll be some unwanted burrs of clay around it. Next, I trim the gallery section thinner. I prefer doing this second to the lid, as it means there's still some heft in this section to support the lid and all that downward pressure I'm applying when trimming it. But I think with the clay in this state, it would be fine even if I didn't. If the clay at this point was too soft, the lid could press the rim section down, deforming the teapot. And if it was too hard, there's a chance that this gallery part could simply crack and fall into the vessel, which over the last couple of years has happened a number of times. Hence why I've sort of trained myself to always trim this section after the lid. And right here, the lid itself felt a bit tight, so with my fingers I'm just very gently stretching the opening just by the smallest amount, not enough to crack or damage the rim, just enough to move it by a fraction of a millimetre. That's all I need. Much better. The next step is to finish the base of the teapot. So to begin with, I slice the pot off the wheelhead, better to remove the lid just in case it falls off, and then I slide the sharp metal point beneath it, separating it, and I then scrape away any clay left on the wheelhead. I then delicately place the lid down, centre it, and then slot the teapot over it. And at this point, the lid is holding the teapot in place like a chuck. And this is something I really like about the types of lids I make, as both components can be used to hold the other in place. It just makes this process of turning them a bit more streamlined. The bottom itself is turned flat, and I'm going to trim a shallow footwell into this, as I think there's enough material in the bottom. A foot ring on a vessel that's used to hold hot water helps to keep the contents warmer for longer, as less of the vessel is coming into contact with the surface it's placed on. It's then stamped with my maker's mark and then set on a high pressure laminate bat, which is very smooth and shouldn't imprint the leather hard clay, as some wooden bats or wearboards might. The last thing I do is turn the step on the underside of the lid to be a bit more defined, especially this right angle here, as its previous slightly curved shape would have meant that the glaze barely reacts over it. So I'm making these edges as sharp as they can be, relatively. And I'm using a spinner to press down with so that I can trim the section really close to the wheelhead. And with these parts trimmed, I can move on to attaching the spout. I slot a wearboard over my wheel to do this, making myself a small temporary desk. The first thing I do is select my favourite spout and then I slice away the excess at the bottom at about a 40-degree angle. And if anything, at this stage, I'm leaving myself more material than necessary. As once again, just like the lid, I'd rather have too much to work with initially than too little, as if I cut the spout to be too short, there's really very little I can do to rectify it, so I'd rather leave it a bit hefty at this point and then cut it back as needed after I've placed it on the side of the teapot to get a feel for what's right. The next thing I do is slice away much of the excess material from the inside using a knife. I thin the walls out and create a gradual curve, and I also make sure there's enough clay in the lower section so that I can easily blend it into the body of the teapot without the spout itself becoming too thin and weak. These slices I'm taking off the back are just making the spout slightly shorter, so proportionally it doesn't overwhelm the teapot body. And lastly, I use a tapering sponge on a stick to smooth over and soften the interior walls, and to remove any jagged marks left by the knife. I then place it softly on the teapot body, positioning it roughly where I want it, making sure that the tip of the spout is more or less in line with the gallery of the teapot body. As if the spout itself is positioned too low, you may only be able to fill the teapot up halfway before liquid starts pouring out, so it needs to project quite high on the vessel as well as spring up and out at approximately a 45-degree angle. As if the spout juts out horizontally, not only will it look really strange, but the tea itself won't flow out of the vessel with enough ferocity, as the liquid isn't moving in the right direction for a good pour. I mark around the spout, remove it, and then pierce some holes. These should prevent tea leaves and tea bags from passing through into the spout and blocking it. I then scrape over them with a knife to remove the worst of the burrs of clay, and then I insert the end of this wooden dowel into each hole and rotate it a few times, just to make sure they're nice and round and neat. I then use a sharp needle to score all the way around them, preparing the area the spout will join onto. I place the spout into a shallow pool of water. This helps the clay soften and will make it easier to blend into the teapot's body. I then dab some slip over these serrated marks. Think of this as glue, almost. I then remove the spout from the water maybe 30 or 40 seconds later, and then I press it onto the prepared area on the teapot body, pushing it firmly against that scored section. I take the lid off and look at the spout and the holes on the inside, and as the spout is relatively soft, I can gently bend it into place so they align perfectly. I then pick it up to look at it from all sides to make sure it's right, and then I can begin blending that soft clay into the teapot's body. This is a slower process. I go all the way around using a fingertip or the round edge of a hole piercer if my fingers can't quite get into the gap. I then use a sponge on a stick to fettle all the way around the area, smoothing over the smeared clay, making the join as flush as possible. The last thing I do is run a finger over these fettled areas, as this is a grogged clay body, and using a sponge to clean the surface grinds away the clay but leaves the coarse particles of sand. So by using my fingertips or one of the sides of the hole piercers again, I can push these coarse specks back into the body, as otherwise I'll be left with quite a rough, grainy surface that could ultimately impact the way the glaze sits on it, creating a patch of glaze that's visually different from how it appears on the rest of the teapot. And with that done, we can move on to attaching the final appendage, which is its handle. This starts out as a length of clay, which is stretched out longer with a wet hand. It's held aloft with my left hand, and every few pulls I change its orientation. This way, the shape of my right hand pulls at this length from two sides, making an even, oval shape. Whereas if it's only pulled from one side, you end up with a shape that's a bit closer to a droplet, which visually won't look very good, and it also won't be very comfortable to use. Essentially, what I'm making now though is a thicker blank which I'll separate into a number of pieces. Each one of these has the potential to become a handle, but just like the spouts, I'm making 3 so I can pick and choose the best. I then take the selected blank, hold it lightly with my left hand, and then use my right hand to tap one end of it out to spread the clay out in a flaring shape. This material that splays out will mean that I can make a more secure join to the teapot in a moment. But first I score and slip a patch opposite the spout, and then I press the flared end against the body of the teapot, with 2 fingers kept inside the vessel opposite the area I'm pushing against to brace the walls and prevent them from distorting. This excess clay I flared out is then blended into the body of the teapot, creating a really strong join which will be helpful during the next step of the process, as with the handle more securely attached, there's less of a chance I'll simply tear it off the teapot as I continue to stretch it out and make it longer. And with the handle blank neatly attached, I can move on to doing the final bit of pulling. I need to be careful not to grip the vessel too tightly with my left hand, as I could indent the lower section of the walls. As for pulling with my right hand, it's very similar to how I was doing it before. I use plenty of water so my hand doesn't stick to the clay, and I pull the length from two sides to make sure it's even, before finishing up by using the tip of my thumb to score 3 subtle grooves into the back of the handle, which helps to make it just that bit finer. With the length long enough, I make sure the back of the handle is nice and curved, and then I change the position of my hands, hold the end of the handle lightly, and then guide it into place. I check to make sure it's in line with the spout, and then I snip any excess off, before finishing the base of the handle in much the same way that I finished the spout, blending it in so it flows naturally back into the body of the teapot. And finally, I just use a wet finger to soften over this area, compress any coarse specks, and to make it as flush and even as it can be. I do a similar thing on the inside, and it's also at this point with a wet finger that I can gently change the shape of the handle. I can make the curves a bit more definite, but I don't want to overdo it at this point, as the clay is still quite weak and it's really easy to make a mistake. And I will actually be doing a bit more refining to this, but in a few days' time once it's turned leather hard. At this point it's so almost finished, but as I've just attached 2 pieces of relatively soft clay to a body that's firmer, I first have to dry this entire assemblage out quite slowly. As if I were to just leave this teapot out, uncovered, the 2 parts that I just attached have a lot more space around them and would dry out much faster than the body, which would most likely cause cracks to form around the joins. So I'll wrap it up tightly in plastic for a day or 2, like this, upside down. It's placed upside down, by the way, so the handle dries without slowly sagging down and losing its shape, and the plastic sheeting that will cover it will help the components all dry out and acclimatise to each other very gradually. So here it is, the handle's still a bit soft with its larger counterpart. I think I've done a pretty good job at replicating it, although I think the spout could have been a touch smaller, but I might be able to refine it a touch once it's turned leather hard in a few days. And remember, this will shrink considerably, so it will be much smaller than the vessel behind it. I don't wrap the vessel up though until the handle and spout have stiffened just a touch, as I don't really want the plastic that I'll wrap this up with to stick to these 2 parts, as it could mark the surface, or, even worse, if it sticks quite firmly onto them, they won't dry, and when the plastic's removed, it could drag these 2 components out of shape, deforming them. It's now a few days later, and the handle and the spout are the same consistency as the body of the teapot. So I'm just going to spend 5 minutes using a knife to very carefully cut away a bit of the excess from around the top join. It really doesn't need a lot of work, but it is surprising how a little goes a long way, especially when perfecting the curve on the underside so it really flows into the body in a very natural, organic way, as if the handle was always meant to be there and has just grown out of the teapot before coming back in to attach close to the bottom. And here it is, finished. The handle is much finer than it was before, and sadly I can't test the piece yet, as if I filled it up with water and poured it out, it could cause some parts of the pot that are nearing bone dry to disintegrate, so I'll have to wait until it's been bisque fired before I can do that, so expect that video soon. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch. I hope you found this video helpful, and as always, I'll see you next time.